Great, thank you. We'll start now. So welcome to this stakeholder feedback webinar organized by IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, as part of our standard revision process. And so this event is part of a series of thematic events that we're organizing between December and January next year on specific topics, specific chapters. And today's chapter of interest is waste and materials management. I am Pierre de Pasquale, and I'm here today with my colleagues, Michelle Smith, Janet Xiao, and Anne Maist. Next slide, please. That's the agenda for today. And for those of you who have attended other sessions already, you'd be familiar with some house rules will be shared. A reminder about the ways for you to contribute today to this revision process. More words about the revision process itself. And then we'll dive into this chapter on waste and materials management, and we'll give you an overview of the proposed changes in this new draft. And we'll have time for questions, answers, and a live chat contribution and discussion. Next slide, please. So the house rules for today. So this event is hosted by IRMA. It's being recorded, and the recording will be made publicly available on our website afterwards. I'm reminding you all that you may not post any unlawful, offensive, threatening, libelous, defamatory, obscene, or objectionable content. You may not post or send or link any hateful or degrading, criminal or sensitive imagery or content, and do not share, advocate, or promote intolerance or hate against other people. You may also not post or send any spam content or attempt to drive attention of the audience to unrelated products, services, or initiatives. Next slide, please. So as I said in the introduction, this event represents one of the many opportunities and channels that are available to contribute to the IRMA standard revision process. And that includes a dedicated online platform, which is really probably our preferred way of receiving your contributions and input. You can find it online, responsiblemining.net/comments2. And today, you can contribute directly via the chat function. This is also why I share these house rules and reminder about what can be shared and what cannot be shared. So the chat is allowed and enabled for everyone. You can share content with the whole audience. Please note that the chat cannot be used in an anonymous way. Next slide, please. And that is unlike the Q&A function. So the other channel you can use today to send your comments, suggestions, feedback, questions, concerns, recommendations to IRMA, either on this particular chapter or the new draft as a whole. Just use the Q&A function. It's located at the bottom of your screen. And please note that you can submit content in an anonymous way here if you prefer. That's also part of IRMA holding, best practice in terms of public consultation. So you can also do that. Next slide, please. Thanks. So all the content that you will share with us today, either via the chat or the Q&A function, will be saved and considered by IRMA as part of the standard revision process. So it's really much everything they will share will be really, considered and taken into account. So that's an important thing for you to know. Next slide, please. So the IRMA revision process itself, if we go to the next slide, IRMA is undergoing and conducting a comprehensive revision of its standards, and in particular, the IRMA standard for responsible mining. So the current version was published in 2018 and is now turning 5 years old. We're doing this revision for multiple reasons. But first of all, to ensure that over time, our system remains accountable to all sectors, all stakeholder groups, and make sure it remains aligned with our mission and vision at IRMA. Now, there are different drivers for the changes that we're making and that we're proposing. Again, reminding you all that this is a work in progress draft that we've shared. So the four drivers are about remaining up to date, making sure that the different chapters and requirements do reflect the latest scientific understanding, and also reflect other norms and guidance and evolution across standards, policies, laws, norms. Another driver is IRMA wanting to add clarity and make the standard clearer, more accessible for all stakeholders. And that also includes for auditors, for companies, making sure that the requirements are also more auditable. It's also a wonderful opportunity for IRMA to add consistency. So better align the structure and the flow and the sequencing of the chapters, and within chapters that are similar, to really embed good management systems practice and management models. And I'll talk about it later on. It's also a great opportunity for us, thanks to this revision process, to fill gaps. So addressing any issues where the IRMA standard may have fallen behind over the course of the last 5 years, and also addressing a number of issues that may have been off the radar 5 years ago, whether they were emerging, nascent, or not even there. And it's important for us to fill these gaps. Next slide, please. Right, and one thing that is very important about this revision process, we are proposing, again, all of this is really at a state of proposition to the world, but we'd like to evolve to address in this new version of the standard the key phases of the mineral supply chain or value chain. So not only extraction and mining, as it is in the 2018 standard, but also integrating and unifying in the draft standards that IRMA published in 2021 to cover exploration and development of projects and mineral processing. So we realized that over the last 2 years, and given all the comments and feedback we received on these drafts, there was such a level of overlap between these three that it actually made more sense to combine them and have one unified draft standard for responsible mining and mineral processing. And this is the draft that we published last month, and that we are seeking input and feedback on. Next slide, please. This consultation draft itself, what is it? I've said it, and I'll say it again, and I'll say it every day if I can. This is not board approved. This is not a final text. This is not a final standard that is set in stone. It's really work in progress. It's an invitation for comments from everybody, for all stakeholder groups, really on the content can be discussed, challenged, changed, the articulation, the mechanics, the context really is here for public comment at this stage. And to inform this process, to make it clear and actionable and user-friendly, we've integrated a number of notes at the beginning of each chapter, a summary of the changes that we propose, and we'll be sharing in these live webinars also on specific topics overviews. We have also included under each requirement specific notes that explain why we're proposing these changes, whether those 4 drivers that I mentioned before, it was not up to date, or the wording wasn't clear, there was a gap to fill, or a consistency issue. And we indicate whether this is a brand new requirement, or revised, or unchanged. And we have highlighted a number of key consultation questions that really sort of lay out the most challenging, or sometimes controversial issues or questions that are being raised by these changes or proposed changes, and that we really like to have feedback and inputs on. And for those of you who prefer to use an Excel version of the draft standard to see all the requirements and the questions, you can find an Excel version on our website. And the whole draft standard is also available in Spanish. It has been translated and it's available on our website. I will put the link in the chat later on. Next slide, please. And to echo what I said before about, remaining up to date and using the experience learning review work of IRMA, this new proposed draft has really been informed in particular by the experience we have gathered at IRMA, thanks to the initial audits that have taken place. You may have noticed and you may know that IRMA has already published 4 independent audit reports at 4 individual mine sites that went through independent audits. And we have between 10 and 12 more, I think, that are already in the almost ready for publication, and many more that are work in progress or ongoing. We've also looked at other standards, as I said, reviewed, evolution among, society expectations, best practice, landscape, emerging issues. We've taken into account all the comments and inputs we received on the exploration and development draft and mineral processing draft that we published in 2021. So over the last 2 years, we also had opportunities to take into account those comments. And we also clearly benefited from our ongoing stakeholder engagement activities and a number of expert working groups that were hosted and convened to work on specific issues. Next slide, please. So the public consultation now is open. We published the draft in October, the end of October. It's a 90-day period. So you have until the end of January to submit your suggestions, comments, recommendations, feedback. All comments will be considered equally and objectively. This is very important. So whether you use today's opportunity to share with us in the chat or in the Q&A, and again, inviting you to really do that as we go along, in particular, if you've already had the chance to read the draft and, look at this chapter, or if you've had experience with the 2018 version and how IRMA addresses waste and materials management. And all the comments and content we receive will be included in a public summary of all comments received, and we'll publish that. And so again, reminding you that you may decide to have your comments and input treated in a confidential manner. You just need to tell us or use the function in the Q&A today. Next slide, please. So very quickly on the different ways for you to contribute. I mentioned it before, the dedicated online platform. You can use it. It's we've again tried to make it very user-friendly. You can go through every single chapter, leave comments at a requirement level, or you can also submit more general comments and contribution, either in PDF or written format. Next slide, please. And we have more traditional channels for you to contribute. You can use a special email address, which is comments@responsiblemining.net, or use our WhatsApp line or our physical address to submit any contribution. Next slide, please. So now we'll dive into the actual changes that we're proposing for this chapter. And, heads up, this is there are a number of substantial changes, both in content and format. So the objectives of this chapter remain pretty much the same as in 2018. It's really to transport, handle, store, treat, and dispose of materials and wastes in a manner that protects worker and community health and safety and the environment. So in 2018, you used to say, to manage materials and waste in a manner, etc. Anyway, we've made more explicit the management steps. Scope of application, this chapter is applicable to all exploration, mining, and mineral processing projects and operations. Clearly, not all requirements will be relevant in all cases, depending on the types of materials, input materials, and the wastes that are generated. But it's also a reminder for you that this new draft, we're proposing to have an integrated draft that can be applicable to exploration, development, permitting, and then operating mines and mineral processing operations. I'll say a bit more about it in another slide. Next slide, please. So I said just now that this chapter, for this chapter, we're proposing a number of substantial changes. And one thing that is very important, and we'll have time after, and I think my colleagues here will also be able to, say more about the history and the rationale, but we're proposing a new approach to this chapter. So in 2018, the emphasis was really on mine waste. So tailings, waste rock, spent ore, and waste generated during the mineral processing. But there was really little attention paid to chemicals used in the processing, so input materials, the chemical constituents of brines, other substances like fuels, explosives that would be, brought to site or even manufactured on site in some cases. And there was little attention paid to the management of non-mine wastes, which can, and let's say it here, it can be generated in extremely large volumes at industrial scale in large scale mines or mineral processing facilities. And they can pose varying degrees of hazards and risks. Next slide, please. So to address this, to make it clearer, to fill the gaps, more comprehensive, more robust, we are proposing in this draft, and again, would love to hear your comments and feedback on it, to separate two aspects of waste management into two different chapters. So today we're talking about this chapter 4.1 on waste and materials management. So it's focusing on the management of the chemicals, input materials, and the potential pollution related aspects of all the wastes that are generated. And separately, a new chapter, which is 4.x at the moment. The number is also up for consultation comment, called Management of Physical Stability. And this one has been designed to focus on the physical stability risks related to mine waste facilities and other facilities in general that you will find on a mine site or in a mineral processing facility. So whereas before we had mixed together we'll look at tailings and we'll look at both the management of and handling of these kind of mine waste and also the stability, maintenance, oversight of the facilities. Now it's been separated out into two chapters. Next slide, please. So that's in terms of format. And when we say, management of materials and waste, we've also reorganized this chapter to add consistency throughout the IRMA standard so that it can flow and look like other chapters that are similar, looking at, the management of risk and impacts. So here we see the different steps here on identification of and characterization of hazards, reduction and mitigation measures, then risk assessment, the management of both hazardous materials and hazardous waste, some specific hazardous materials and hazardous waste that require specific attention and management procedures. We have a criterion on spill preparedness and response. Then we'll look at inspections, corrective actions, and then reporting and disclosure, which is always an important transparency dimension across the IRMA standard. Next slide, please. And this really maps out to good management practice, which is one thing I said earlier, that when reviewing the standard and proposing these changes, we've really tried to embed as much as possible standard management practice and just good management systems approach, and particularly around the promotion and operationalization of continuous improvement. So this plan, do, check, act cycle is a very common universal model to operationalize continuous improvement. And so if we go to the next slide here, yeah, we see how these four critical and interconnected steps do map or align with these management steps that I presented before and that structure this chapter. So identification of hazard, reduction and mitigation measures, and risk assessment are already part of your plan step. The do step will look at the management plans, specific materials, specific waste procedures and protocols, the spill preparedness and response. When it comes to checking on performance and effectiveness, this is where the inspections requirements come in. And then closing in this continuous improvement loop or cycle, you have all the corrective actions related requirements. Next slide, please. Yes, and here again, putting here again the strong, open data transparency dimension of the IRMA standard when it comes to reporting and disclosure requirements. Next slide, please. So that's more in terms of formats. In terms of the scope of application, I said it earlier, but it's probably even more explicit here and more explanatory. So what do we cover here under waste and materials management? So we cover the materials and chemicals brought to the site, and here there's quite a comprehensive list, and in the draft standard, well, I'll talk about it later. So that would cover fuel, solvents, explosives, processing agents and reagents, any feedstock material for mineral processing, input chemicals, cement instrumentation, that some of them may be radioactive or have hazardous materials in it. That's all the input materials and chemicals. Then you have all the materials that are produced or extracted as part of the processes, so mining or mineral processing. So the ore, the brines, the concentrates that are produced or extracted on site. So that's for the materials. And then the wastes, we're covering all the wastes that are produced. So whether generated by the processes themselves, like tailings, waste rock, overburden, spent ore, mine water, processing waste, etc. But also the waste that are generated because of using the materials and chemicals that are brought to site. So kind of non-mine related waste, such as equipment, tires, machinery that can't be, repaired or reused, construction waste, garbage, sewage, also from, staff and people on site. So much broader and clearly much more comprehensive and complete than what we currently have in the 2018 mining standard. Next slide, please. When it comes to filling gaps that were identified, so not only the scope expansion to make sure we also look at materials and not only mine waste, we've also added a number of new requirements to make sure there's a comprehensive and systematic identification of these categories of waste and materials, to also then be able to do the chemical characterization of any liquid material and waste produced as a result of mining related activities, and characterization of waste that is not derived from mining. So again, really informed by what I said before, to make sure this is managed in a comprehensive and robust way. So identification and characterization. Next slide, please. We've also added a new criterion, so a set of requirements on material and waste reduction and mitigation. So there are different terminologies, and other standards often refer to the waste mitigation hierarchy, even though it's not exactly the same step as the sort of mitigation hierarchy for other environmental topics. But it's really about setting out priority of actions that should be taken with first and foremost, prevention of the production of waste and hazardous material, and then what can you do to reduce or minimize these amounts, and then looking at reuse, recycling, and then to sort of sort of least or last resort, looking at energy recovery and then disposal if you don't have any other options. Really putting the priority on the first links in this mitigation hierarchy chain or reduction hierarchy chain. Next slide, please. We've also added clarity where we have elaborated and expanded some requirements on the documentation, identification and mitigation requirements related to management. And also we've added or clarified also around storage and transportation of waste and materials. So that's all under 4.1, 4.1, 4.4, and 4.1.5 criteria. Next slide, please. One also substantial and important change that we're proposing here, also in terms of consistency, and having reviewed and learned and heard from many stakeholders on the current 2018 mining standard, we're proposing to incorporate all the requirements, pretty much all the requirements from the cyanide management and mercury management from the 2018 mining standard. So that is currently chapters 4.7 and 4.8. You can now find them under 4.1.6.1 and 4.1.6.2 in this new chapter on waste and materials management. There are just a few elements of these chapters that are also found under water management, and we talked about that last week. But you can find it; it's very clearly explained in the draft. Next slide, please. Also, in terms of filling some gaps that we noticed and realized, we've added new specific spill response requirements. So there wasn't a specific requirement on responding to spill in the 2018 mining standard, and there isn't. So here we've really tried to make again a robust set of requirements, a combination of planning, training, and designing these response and preparedness measures in collaboration with stakeholders. I guess one thing that we'll also be able to touch on and discuss today, the kind of emergency situation are not operating or happening in silos. So there are also other emergency preparedness response requirements under other chapters, whether it comes to sort of social responsibility, community emergency preparedness, response planning, health and safety. So it's not necessarily a need to create ad hoc, specific, isolated planning and training programs, but it's a way for everybody to ensure here that this specific events and situations are covered, whether as ad hoc documents or in existing management plans and procedures and training. Next slide, please. And we've added a number of other requirements to fill gaps and also be consistent with how these issues are addressed under other chapters. So requirement around making sure that work can be stopped if unsafe conditions are observed. So in relations to waste and materials management, which is aligned with chapter 3.2 that we actually discussed earlier today on occupational health and safety. A new requirement on access to information policy, which we could also talk about if you're interested in that, and how we've aligned that across the draft standard. And also a requirement for entities to disclose relevant information on the hazardous properties and health and environmental effects of materials and wastes that may pose risks. Disclosing and sharing this information with local authorities and emergency services. Again, to fill gap, but add consistency throughout the different chapters. Next slide, please. So that was the overview of the changes. Quite comprehensive, but of course, there are much more details in the draft itself. that you can find on our website, both in English and Spanish, if you want to dig more. And I really invite you all, if you haven't had the chance yet, to look at it. What I'm sharing here with you is an extract from a document that is available also online under resources on our website. And because we've integrated now all the phases from early exploration to project development to actual mining or mineral processing, we've published this applicability document where you can see for every single requirement whether they can apply or not to different phases. So you see here that stage 1 and stage 2 of exploration, so sort of desk-based exploration and very early exploration activities. There are no requirements here that are required or applicable. And then there are a number of specific requirements that also are not necessarily applicable. You can find it all in the document online if you have a question on it. But it's very useful for particular companies, depending on where they are, what stage they are, to maneuver and understand the new draft. Next slide, please. Now I have a few more slides that I'm sharing with you before we go into the sort of discussion conversation. And again, reminding you that you can use the Q&A function, you can use the chat. Please feel free to share, already any comments or feedback of input that you may have. If we look at just the absolute number of requirements from a very mathematical perspective, there are 28 requirements in the current 2018 standard for responsible mining when it comes to waste and materials management. Now in the new proposed draft, we have 24 requirements. And it's just funny because as we go, through different chapters and we do these live consultations, it's interesting how, the numbers vary from one chapter to another. And here you see that the number actually goes down, but what does it mean in practice? Does it mean that there are less, more, same amount of requirements, same number of topics? Well, in practice, we've deleted 2 policy requirements or like governance requirements because actually most of the environmental, like specific environmental chapters didn't have a policy requirement. And we've integrated that and made it more consistent. So we've deleted 2 the requirements related to the facilities. So tailings dams, tailings ponds, any waste storage facilities. As I said before, so all the ones we had under 4.1.3, 4.1.5, and 4.1.6 that were related to facility management are now moved under this new chapter that I introduced or mentioned before, the 4.x, doesn't have a number at the moment. And at the same time, so we've moved or deleted a number of requirements, and at the same time, we've integrated the chapters on cyanide and mercury that in the 2018 standard are numbered 4.7 and 4.8. So next slide, please. In practice, even though we have less requirements, there are 6 new elements. So this is really where we're filling a number of gaps or making sure the standard stays up to date. So we've included also input chemicals and non-mine waste. So we've made that, as I said, more robust, more comprehensive and clearer. We've added this initial hazard identification, hazard characterization requirements or steps up front. We have introduced this reduction or mitigation approach with the hierarchy that I described before. We've added those specific requirements on the spill response, preparedness and response, access to information, and the one I mentioned also at as the sort of the last element in this overview, the requirement to share information and relevant information with local authorities and emergency services. So this is not a huge addition, but clearly, emphasizing again the change in the rationale, the approach, how we've separated things out to make it clear. Next slide, please. And now what I'm sharing with you is a number of key consultation questions. So coming directly from the draft. And as I said in the beginning, we have highlighted throughout the document consultation questions. So even though you're more than welcome to share comments and feedback on everything, from every single word to requirement, chapter, organization, we have shared a number of, I think, guidance elements or maybe more tricky or challenging or controversial issues where we think it's important to spend time and have comments on. And I've pulled out some of them here in the presentation. So first of all, about this new approach, this wider scope, making sure we clearly cover hazardous materials that are not just mine waste and also other waste that are not necessarily related to the mining processes, and how we've separated the physical stability of facilities, including tailings storage facilities. So what do you think? We would really love to have your feedback, opinion, comments. There are some very solid and good reasons for doing so, but there are clearly also arguments and reasons for not doing so. So we'd love to have your reflections and comment on that. Next slide, please. Regarding the waste mitigation hierarchy or reduction hierarchy that I've mentioned now a couple of times in this presentation, so prioritizing the prevention and reduction and minimization of the production of materials and waste, and then going to reuse, recycle, energy recovery, and then as a very last resort, disposal. Do you think that energy recovery from waste, so the penultimate element, is still considered an acceptable practice? Because it's quite a controversial element, and a number of people, organizations, experts have argued against it. We're proposing to integrate it in the draft, but we're very much aware of the pros and cons, and we'd like to hear from you whether you think IRMA should include it in the list or just not consider it an acceptable option. And if we go to the next slide, please, we see here that if you look at the four first elements on preventing the actual generation of waste and materials in the first place, then reduction, reuse, recycling, this really align with circularity, concept of circularity. And even though this may not exist at every site, every mine, every mineral processing facility or operation, we're very curious to hear from you if IRMA should go further, because the concepts of circularity are not strongly present and integrated in this chapter. It's mentioned and touched upon in other chapters, but it's really something that we would like to hear your comments, feedback, and inputs on circularity into this chapter and also across the standard. Next slide, please. Regarding non-hazardous waste and materials, so that's under 4.1.2.3 in the new draft. We have not included requirements related to non-hazardous materials, such as materials used in construction of buildings. The requirements we have on construction materials are only if they present any risk or hazardous characteristics. Again, it's a choice that has been made. Now it's work in progress. This is a draft. We're in a public comment period. Everything is really up for discussion, comment, revisiting, rethinking. So we'd love to hear from you if you agree with this approach, if IRMA should go further, include requirements for the management of materials that are actually non-hazardous, just in terms of the amount, how they handle, transported, stored, and what would you suggest would be appropriate expectations regarding them. And clearly, would there be any particular categories, types of materials that are non-hazardous that would require greater attention than others. Again, we very much welcome comments and feedback on that. So that's for non-hazardous materials. And then regarding non-hazardous wastes, again, a question. So if you look at requirement 4.1.2.3 in the draft standard, where there's a requirement to develop and implement measures, again, align with the waste mitigation hierarchy to prevent, reduce, reuse, recycle, recover, or dispose non-hazardous waste. But would it be reasonable to limit this requirement to the types of non-hazardous waste that are most likely to have environmental and health risks? Or should all non-hazardous waste be evaluated? And any additional requirements for non-hazardous waste should be added, specific procedures or management plans. So beyond the what would be required into the plans in those other chapters. Next slide, please. So regarding inspection, so that's under criterion 4.1.8. We're proposing annual inspections, but do you think that these types of inspections should occur at a higher frequency? Again, this is very much a question open at the moment. Do they require a weekly, monthly, quarterly inspection rather than annual? So if 4.1.8 is really about inspection of the condition of the areas where materials and waste are handled, mixed, stored, disposed, the structures, such as tanks, pipes, pipelines, secondary containment systems, alarms, and then the effectiveness of control mitigation measures meant to prevent any release or spill in the workplace or in the environment. So that's the first question. And second, on inspection, still, there'll be cases when entities actually send their hazardous waste to other disposal facilities. So they leave the area and the operations and they're being handled and processed somewhere else. And so if those facilities are not managed in a responsible way, it's possible, very much possible, for the entity that has produced these wastes in the first place to contribute to impacts and adverse impacts on health, on safety, on the environment, on communities who live around these disposal facilities, whether in the same country or there are examples where they're actually exported to other countries. So should there be, we don't address this really in the proposed draft. And so we're curious to hear what your recommendations would be in terms of, or whether or not having requirements on due diligence required to ensure that this kind of third-party disposal is done in a responsible way or adhere to certain standards, requirements, and if there's a need for monitoring by the entity that is producing these wastes in the first place. Next slide, please. Right, I think I'm done with the consultation questions that I wanted to highlight. Of course, there are more in the draft. You can find them online, and I'll be also sharing links to additional material and resources. But I think now I'll turn to I think I'll stop here and I'll hand over to Michelle to guide us through all the questions and comments that we received. Thank you.
We have some great questions coming in, Pierre. Questions and comments. I am going to ask the questions first, but I do want to make sure that everybody knows if you have submitted a comment here or question, all of those will be logged. So even if we don't actually acknowledge your comment today, if we don't have time, I just want you to know that your comments will be logged into our system. And you are also welcome to log in and submit that with more information if you'd like to. So we have a couple of questions that relate to the term non-hazardous. One question just generally, how is non-hazardous being defined? And then as a follow-up to that, a comment that says, we believe that all wastes need to be tested to demonstrate that they are non-hazardous unless they're classified as non-hazardous by legislation, which I think is an interesting topic because some legislations define non-hazardous differently than others, right? And so I think there's a question in there maybe to us in, are we allowing non-hazardous to be defined by regulation or using a common set of criteria at IRMA? And then kind of following up there is an assumption that waste rock is not hazardous. And I think by that, this person probably means commonly out there can be an assumption that waste rock is not hazardous, but that's not always the case. So do you have a comment on how we're defining non-hazardous?
Yes, I think we're doing it in a very, how'd you say? In an interesting way. That is, we define what's hazardous. And then by exclusion, everything that is not hazardous would fall into the non-hazardous category. So at the moment, we have clear definitions in our glossary that, any hazardous materials or wastes would be chemicals, materials, waste with properties or characteristics that make them a physical, health, or environmental hazard. And clearly here, there would be, I think, cases where, depending on the national law, there might be differences. So we don't have clear, for example, underwater, we have, and I'm sure Anne could say more maybe about it. We have, water quality table where we've done a review of existing standard norms, thresholds, limits across various jurisdictions. We haven't done that with, how different jurisdictions and laws define categories of hazardous and non-hazardous materials and waste. And that could be something that we add or expand. I don't know, Anne, if you want to add anything on that.
Yeah, thanks. It is a really good question. And as Pierre said, we don't really define non-hazardous. I mean, the only sort of definition that we give it is garbage. That's one example of something that could be considered non-hazardous. And I believe there's a consultation question about characterization of non-hazardous materials or wastes. But, for example, in the United States, we have this thing called the bevel exclusion, which, as the person mentioned, waste rock is not considered hazardous no matter what characteristics it has. And the same would be true of tailings. But IRMA is not taking that approach. IRMA is saying, let's characterize these wastes and see what they have. And then we can come up with contaminants of potential concern or not. And then take it from there. So, but I think that might be a question, should we define non-hazardous waste more clearly, for example, in the glossary in 4.1? So good question.
I have two questions that I'm pretty sure relate to each other. And Anne, I'm going to ask these questions of you. The first question is, what is lime used for in a copper mine? Is it used in extraction or processing? And then there's a follow-up question that says, is it used in tailings management and other environmental safety management actions? Is that something you feel comfortable answering?
Yeah, so lime, I assume you're talking about calcium oxide, calcium hydroxide. Lime is used, I guess, obviously to adjust the pH, to increase the pH. So you often need that in the tailings when you crush and grind the ore and put it in a flotation operation. So this would be if it's a sulfide, copper sulfide ore, then you would add lime to the process to increase the pH. You also might use lime in a copper mine to treat water, for example. So, those are the two most obvious ones. And then if it's a copper dump leach, where instead of flotation, you've got piles of ore that you're leaching with sulfuric acid usually, then you might need to adjust the pH once that comes back into the process. Raise it a bit and then lower it a bit. So it's really a pH adjuster, and there are several places on the site where that could be used.
Great. Thanks, Sam.
Mm-hmm.
Pierre, this is a comment, but I think I'm going to phrase it as a question back to you. This person has said, I'm not comfortable with including energy recovery as compulsory prior to considering disposal. And I think this goes back to your slide where you walk through kind of the options. There are many circumstances under which waste cannot be converted to energy without creating air quality dangers. So my question to you, given this comment, is when you laid out that process, were you assuming that each stage was compulsory, or would there be an expectation to kind of weigh pros and cons of different stages?
Yes, no, thanks for the comment. And again, as everything is work in progress, we really much value these comments. We've put it in there because the logic wants it to be there before the disposal, but clearly, and that's something we've highlighted, and if you read the full consultation question there, it may not be applicable to every situation. And it's also because we're very much aware of the potential risks and impacts that this can cause. There are a number of scenarios and contexts where it shouldn't be an option. So we have this sort of general question, could it be accepted as an option if the context and the elements make it a relevant and safe option? So altogether, but I pretty get your point. I think we will review the draft, and if needs to be clarified, we can clarify that this is not a mandatory step to be taken into account. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Pierre. We have another comment here, and you got a thank you, by the way. So I think we've answered a question, one of those last two. We have a comment here that says, to be prescriptive about the frequency of inspection may not be practical. There are some things that have to be checked at least weekly on something like a tailing storage facility, but there are others that only need to be confirmed annually. Suggest relating it to a risk hazard rating.
Yeah, that's a good point, certainly. And I think maybe one of the questions is this an inspection by IRMA, or is this an inspection by the mine itself? And there's certainly, the mine would normally be checking many things on more frequent basis than annual. But I think it's something to consider in the drafting.
I think so. The requirement, and I agree with you, there are different things between the sort of auditing and surveillance, IRMA surveillance system. Here, this particular, the requirements I mentioned and the consultation question I pulled out is on the entity, so the mining company or the mineral processor itself, that will be required to annually inspect. So what I said, conditions of the areas where the materials and waste are being handled or disposed, the different structure, the containment systems. But I think this is a very good point. At the moment, it says annually or more frequently. I think from a management and sort of good management perspective, it would definitely make sense to make it dependent on the levels of risks and how certain areas should require more frequent monitoring and inspection. From an auditing perspective, Michelle, I would like to hear your thought maybe on whether this is doable, operationalizable, how practical it is to make it dependent to different levels of risks. I think we do that in other chapters. So
I think it's certainly doable, and it strikes me too that in addition to risk being an important criteria there, the dynamic nature of the operation that you're talking about also, I think, would influence the frequency of inspection. For instance, some things are kind of steady state, right? But there are other things where activity is constantly changing in that area, and where you have those sorts of conditions, I think you would want to have inspections probably more frequently, especially if there's, a significant risk associated with it. And I think maybe what you might be asking is, how do auditors determine, like, what's the appropriate frequency? And I think there's always a balance in these audits between objective and subjective criteria, right? But given my, 30 years of auditing, I think we always go back to, are you doing it often enough to be able to detect changes that could have a significant effect on operations?
I think the other factor here that we might need to think about is AI, and automatic monitoring is really useful, but then what happens with all the data? How are the data evaluated? And it's something that we'll probably see a whole lot more of in the very near future, is AI evaluations, let's call them. So but it sounds like maybe we need a little more clarity on this topic.
There's a follow-up question here that says, does IRMA take part in inspections, and which entity in a developing country would request IRMA's participation? So I'll answer that one, that IRMA conducts audits of evidence. So the IRMA auditors would go to a facility, and they may observe inspections taking place, and they may review inspection records. They may interview people who conduct inspections. They may review training records for the people who are conducting inspections. But IRMA does not replace the need for facilities to have their own inside inspection program, which is intended kind of as part of maintenance of an operation. And so I think I'm looking back at that question. So a developing country, I think, would want to make sure that they're understanding how the operation is conducting their inspections, documenting their inspections, that they're being done by competent people. We have, I know, 1 minute left, and a lot of great questions coming in. I think the last one is, getting an auditor who can understand a lot of these technical areas is going to be extremely difficult. How are they going to be able to check tailings audits, and should they? So that is a big question. I think it'll be answered in the chapter when we cover tailings more thoroughly, which will be the physical stability chapter. But just as a reminder, the IRMA standard points mines to existing requirements out there that require that you have tailings maintenance programs, regular tailings inspections done by external parties. IRMA auditors are not evaluating tailings facilities to determine that the tailings facilities have been constructed correctly, that maintenance is being performed as planned, that facilities have followed up on corrective actions. So IRMA auditors are not doing those inspections. They're not signing off on tailings. What they're doing is evaluating whether or not the facility is following prescribed management procedures for tailings facilities, and that the work has been done by professionals. So stay tuned. We'd love to have you attend that follow-up session, that consultation session as well.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Yep, it's 9 o'clock, so I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And again, inviting you to, go look at the draft standard that is available online. And we very much look forward to hearing all your comments, feedback, and comments. And there are more events and live consultations taking place until the end of January. So we'll also welcome you there. And we wish you a good day. Take care.